the scourge of disease. But he couldn't escape politics. Amidst controversy, Bienville was recalled to France. His successor was Commandant Etienne de Perier. Unfortunately, he did not share Bienville's esteem for Louisiana's Indians.
Before the French came amongst us, we were men, content with what we had. We walked with boldness every road, because we were then our own masters. But now we go groping, afraid of meeting thorns. We walk like slaves, which we shall soon be, since the French already treat us as if we were such.
Once allies of the French under Bienville, the Natchez launched a surprise attack against the colonists at Fort Rosalie.
The tribes cut the throats of all except 3 or 4, who fortunately escaped and brought the news here. The men were set afire and left to burn slowly for the entire day. The post was utterly destroyed. Jean-Charles de Pradelle.
Outraged, Perier retaliated by exterminating almost the entire Natchez Nation. The few who survived were taken in by the Chickasaw Indians. But the war dealt a heavy blow to the colony. Nearly 10% of the French population had been killed, and the rest were fearful and demoralized. Yet again, the colony turned to Bienville. Bienville was 53 years old when he took command of Louisiana for a 3rd time. As a young man, he had earned the respect of the Indians, and the colonists hoped he would restore peace to Louisiana. But instead, Bienville found himself fighting another bloody war, this time against the Chickasaw tribe.
Part of the reason for the Chickasaw Wars in 1736 and 1740, aside from trying to get the Natchez back, was also to retain control of the river.
As pawns of the British, the Chickasaws were well armed. Time after time, they defeated the French and their Indian allies in a humiliating war that dragged on for years. By the time peace finally came, Bienville had grown old in the service of the king.
The labor, anxiety, the trouble of mind which I have had to bear has so enfeebled my health that I should not hesitate to beg you to give me leave to come over to France by the first vessel of the king. I wish only that the officer who will be chosen to succeed me may be happier than I. Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, Sieur de Bienville.
Discouraged and exhausted, Bienville retired and left Louisiana for good. On March 7th, 1767, nearly 3/4 of a century after he and his brother first explored the muddy waters of the Mississippi, Bienville died in Paris at the age of 88. A bachelor his entire life, Bienville left no children, but he bears the rightful title, Father of Louisiana. Neglected by the mother country for some 60 years, Louisiana had waited in the wings to play her part in history. Then, in the middle of the 18th century, she was thrust onto the stage of world events. In 1754, fighting broke out in the backwoods of Pennsylvania. Anglo-American settlers and soldiers were spilling westward over the Appalachian Mountains into French and Indian lands. Leading the British forces was an inexperienced young officer from Virginia named George Washington. That small skirmish sparked the French and Indian War. The conflict soon engulfed Canada, the West Indies, and Europe, reaching as far as India. A truly world war. When it was over, France had lost everything. A British flag now flew over most of her once vast empire in the New World. But before England could take control of the Mississippi River, Louis XV secretly handed over Louisiana to his cousin, the King of Spain.
Spain suddenly finds herself with this whole colony. She cedes her Florida territories. The Isle of Orleans is all she has left on the east bank at the end of the French and Indian War. And she takes over all of Louisiana, all of the west bank of the Mississippi. And France is out of the New World.
The trouble was, there weren't any Spaniards. In New Orleans, French Captain Charles Aubry was ordered to hand over control of the colony when the Spanish arrived. He waited and waited. But instead of the boatloads of Spanish immigrants he expected, Captain Aubry found himself welcoming the first families in a huge new wave of French settlers, the Acadians.
Louisiana basically remained French, and it remained French because of that tremendous influx of the Acadians that came in from 1765 to 1785. 6,000, which was a lot. That was a big percentage.
The Acadians, or Cajuns as they're often called today, were French Catholic families who made their home in Acadie, what is now Nova Scotia. These were families like the Broussards, the Thibodeaux, and the Arsenaults. For a century and a half, they lived there peacefully with the Indians, building a prosperous society, a distinct culture, and a fierce sense of independence. But Anglo-Americans in New England had cast an envious eye upon their Acadian neighbors to the north.
They had the wealth, basically. They were the dominant cultural population group in the area, much to the chagrin of the British. And you begin to get a constant drumbeat to do something about it, to somehow expropriate this rich farmland and this wealth and give it to Protestants. There were a group of wealthy merchants and fleet owners in Massachusetts, real estate developers who wanted to get their hand on Nova Scotia. But you had to get rid of the Acadians first. And so they used this religious bigotry as one of the ploys to stimulate eventually what would become Le Grand Dérangement, the forcible exile of the Acadians from their homeland.
But the British officials sought to do far worse than simply take the Acadians' homeland from them.
When they exiled the Acadians in 1755, they meant to break up that society into small enough pieces and integrate those small pieces into existing English settlements so that there would be no longer a society that would call themselves Acadians.
Ethnic cleansing. That's essentially what was happening. They were cleansing that area of an ethnic group, that is, the Acadians.
As much as half the entire population died during the exile. They wandered throughout the world, seeking lost family members and searching for a new homeland. Then at the end of the French and Indian War, some of them came here, to Louisiana.
They fell in love with the place immediately. These beautiful oak trees and obviously very rich soil, waterways, fishing, swamps, marshes, prairies, and the thing they wanted most of all, isolation. It would give them a chance to rebuild their own and save their own culture.
The point of coming to Louisiana for the Acadians was to regroup. They referred to Louisiana as La Nouvelle Acadie, New Acadia.
Not long after these first Acadians arrived, so did Louisiana's Spanish governor, Don Antonio Ulloa. He was not so welcome.
Ulloa was a man of the Enlightenment, a scientist, very progressive, very Spanish.
But to the aristocracy of New Orleans, this quiet intellectual was merely aloof and unsociable. Ulloa's restrictions on free trade inflamed the colonists. Perhaps worst of all, he wasn't French.
There was a vocal group that were asking to be returned to the French monarchy. Many petitions go back to France just after France ceded Louisiana to Spain, asking the French king not to do this, but it was a done deal.
On October 28, 1768, New Orleans businessmen assembled 1,000 disgruntled colonists, supplied with muskets and plenty of good Bordeaux. The drunken mob drove Governor Ulloa from Louisiana, but the party didn't last very long. In 1769, a fleet of 12 Spanish warships arrived in New Orleans under the command of an Irish-born general, Alejandro O'Reilly. Leading an army of 2,000, 1/3 of the population of the area, O'Reilly offered the rebellious colony a sobering show of force.
O'Reilly was completely a military man. He had enforced the barbaric punishments that the military code required for soldiers and sailors, and so it shouldn't be a surprise that he executed 5 of the people who had been responsible for ejecting Ulloa. That constituted treason.
Louisiana's revolt against the Spanish crown quickly died, but it was a sign of the greater age of revolutions that was just beginning.
Revolutions put Louisiana on the map of international affairs. The American Revolution brought for the first time worldwide attention to the lower Mississippi Valley.
Unrest was brewing in the British colonies. When the American Revolution came, Spain saw an opportunity to strike a blow at an old enemy, the British. Leading Louisiana into battle was a brash Spanish general named Bernardo de Galvez.
Galvez was only 29 when he came to Louisiana, and it was at the time when the American Revolution was going on, and the Spanish had a secret treaty with the Americans to fight the British.
It is the decision of His Majesty that the principal objective of his arms in these dominions is to drive the English from the Gulf of Mexico and the banks of the Mississippi. Martin Navarro, Chief Financial Officer, Spanish Louisiana.
Galvez and his men first took the English fort at New Richmond, which is present-day Baton Rouge. From there, he drove British forces out of Louisiana and captured the entire Gulf Coast and Florida. Louisianians, like General Galvez, played an important role in the founding of the United States. But the American Revolution was not won solely by military heroes. Armies need supplies, and often it was the New Orleans merchants who provided them. Businessmen like Oliver Pollock.
Oliver Pollock is sometimes known as the forgotten patriot of the American Revolution. He was passionately committed to the rebel cause. The gunpowder that won the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga came from Oliver Pollock in New Orleans.
While Americans were planting the seeds of a new nation in the East, Louisiana matured and blossomed under the care of orderly Spanish governors. During their 40-year rule, the Spanish managed to increase the population of Louisiana by more than 5-fold. While most of those coming to the colony were of African or French heritage, others brought a distinctly Spanish character to Louisiana.
From all the islands, many people will gather. They know that the province of Louisiana is fertile and unpopulated. And towards this goal, many will go with families. Matias de Galvez, governor of the Canary Islands.
To help defend the colony, Spain sent 2,010 settlers from the Canary Islands off northwest Africa. These islanders, or isleños, formed fishing communities in St. Bernard Parish, which persist there today. Other settlers came from Malaga, Spain, led by Colonel Francisco Bulani. They founded a Spanish settlement on Bayou Teche and named it New Iberia, after their homeland. The descendants of these settlers include families with names like Miguez, Romero, and Blanco. After years of acculturation, however, they're more likely to speak Cajun French today than Spanish. Spanish settlements throughout Louisiana were linked by the Camino Real, the King's Road. Across vast stretches of wilderness, it connected New Iberia, Natchitoches, and San Antonio. But in Spanish Louisiana, all roads led to New Orleans.
New Orleans' role as a major commercial center came during the period of Spanish domination at New Orleans, especially during the American Revolution. Language, architecture, Louisiana customs all have their roots in the Spanish period. What is today the Vieux Carré, the French Quarter of New Orleans, in its architectural style, really isn't French at all. Most of the colonial buildings in the French Quarter date from the Spanish period and show Spanish styles of architecture.
Under Governors Miro and Carondelet, Louisiana undertook ambitious new construction projects, especially in New Orleans. The city was built largely on the generosity of one man, Spanish philanthropist Don Andreas Almonester.
It was he who rebuilt the St. Louis Cathedral after one of the great fires, and he built the presbytere, the priest's house, and the cabildo, which was the city council.
From warehouses to public buildings to private homes, Almonester shaped the face of New Orleans.
Almonester was in many ways a typical Spanish bureaucrat. He loved precise numbers. He loved close accounting of things. He had, I think, a very truly generous, humane spirit.
Almonester gave New Orleans a first-rate charity hospital dedicated to providing the finest care to all its patients, whether they were rich or poor, slave or free. The only thing New Orleans needed more than hospitals was cemeteries.
Smallpox, yellow fever, cholera, scarlet fever, typhoid, malaria, every form of pestilence visited the port. It was a tremendously unsafe place to live.
Every summer, plagues claimed a share of the population. Soon New Orleans was skirted by vast cemeteries, built above ground like small cities unto themselves.
The marshy conditions of the land were such a problem to the living. They were even more of a problem to the dead people. So they began to bury people above ground, to build little vaults for them above the ground. And they'd use the same tombs over and over again. They'd just push the bones to the back and reuse these little stone edifices.
Plagues were not the only danger New Orleanians had to contend with. Fires destroyed 4/5 of the city's business district during Spanish rule. And if the fires weren't enough, there were the floods. Life in Louisiana was often harsh and short. So the people of Creole Louisiana learned to celebrate the passing pleasures of this world.
From the earliest times, people in Louisiana loved to eat. Governor Miro commented that he was making 4,000 pesos a year and he was spending 8,000 of it in entertaining, and it was expected of him.
But it wasn't just the governor who liked to entertain. New Orleans became a city famous for its sumptuous balls and masquerades.
All through the Spanish period and the American period, balls were everywhere. There were probably 3 or 4 a week. At one time, I think there were 50 ballrooms in New Orleans that were very well attended several nights a week.
Extravagance was the order of the day. A ball might begin with 50 dishes for supper.
Then around midnight, there would be a snack. Then about 3 in the morning, there would be breakfast. And then about 8 in the morning, before everybody went home, there'd be some more snacks and some more coffee. Fantastic amounts of coffee, cakes of every sort.
Of course, New Orleanians indulged in more than just coffee and cakes. One item alone constituted a third of all imports to the city: alcohol. But while